Okay, so I've been working on another Yokomo YZ10 build. Surprise, surprise, I have a whole ton of these. And I figured that for this one, I would try to do a hex wheel conversion on the long arms. I had experimented around with doing hex wheel conversions on the Works YZ10s and the later model like 94 and 95 YZ10s, which have essentially the same length of an arm. And I sort of gave up trying to find the right dog bones and wheel axles at the time because it was getting expensive. But I figured I had a few more tricks up my sleeve this time around, and I think I figured it out. So for the front, real simple, you can use the Kyosho 74mm dog bone, which is new to Kyosho's line that comes with, I think, the ZX7. And in the past, they've had a 73mm dog bone, which you could also use. It's just a 1mm difference in length, but I have a 74 up here. And then for the wheel axle, you have to use a different wheel axle. This one here, I think this is a UM52101, and you can tell that it's the long wheel axle. A little hard to see here with the lighting. Where you see those little three bands, 1, 2, 3 bands there, that tells you that it's essentially the long wheel axle. So you mate this to the 74mm dog bone, and then you put a 3mm axle shim on the inside, and that basically gets the full dog bone length to effectively 77mm. And you use the YZ10 Works or the 94 YZ10 front caster block and steering block assembly, and with that 3mm axle shim on the inside, the hole for the axle pin on the outside is just perfectly aligned to the outer bearing. There's no binding or anything, so you can put a wheel hex on there and everything spins freely. What's also good about this approach is that it pushes the universal joint out so that it's not contained within the inside housing of this steering hub. In the past, I had a different assembly where I had a different wheel axle and a different dog bone length, and this joint was inside the inner housing, and they gave essentially the outer circumference here of this universal joint is just large enough that it rubs a little bit against the inside of the housing of this steering block, so you get some binding. By doing it this way, by using a longer wheel axle and pushing everything in a bit, it's just the perfect size so that that joint is outside of that housing, and so it can spin freely. Okay, so this fits perfectly fine. Let me see if I can get a decent shot here of the dog bone insertion. You can see right there, that's where the dog bone pin is at full droop, and there's no binding of the dog bone against the inside of the diff outdrive. So this is all nice and free and smooth, and this works, which is great. On the rear, you do have some options. So the option I'm choosing right now may or may not be the one that I end up with. Here I'm using a 73mm dog bone and a different wheel axle. This wheel axle is a UM52202. So instead of having 3 bands here, it has 2 bands. And what I do is I take that sort of medium length wheel axle, put it on, made it to the 73mm dog bone, and instead of using the YZ10 hub carrier, this guy, I use a Kyosho laser hub carrier, and there are a few reasons for that. First, this hub carrier is like 1 or 2 millimeters too wide, maybe about a millimeter too wide, so that when you have the medium length, the 522 axle with a 2mm axle shim on the inside, the pin, this hole here where the dog bone pin goes into, is not quite far enough out for it to fit the dog bone pin through and not have it grind up against the outer bearing. So you could make this work with the UM521, the 3-bar, the long axle, this one right here, but you'd have to use something like either a 2mm axle shim and have this pin be a little bit too far out, or try to do like a 2.5mm axle shim, and that'll put the pin in just about the right spot. So that's why I opted against this. The other reason is because this only has one option here for the outer camber link mounting point. The Kyosho laser is much more adjustable. You have 6 holes here, and the offset of the hub and everything else is about the same, so you're not changing the width. And this hole right here on the YZ10 hub is almost the same as using the upper inside hole here. So if you want less camber gain, you can go out, or if you want to drop the roll center, you can go down a bit. So there's more tuning options here. It's also the laser rear hub carrier. It's a little bit narrower here where it mounts into the arm. So instead of having about a 6mm space between the width of the hub and the inside opening of the arm, as you do with the YZ10 part, you have 9mm here to play with. So it's a lot more movement back and forth you can do with the hub to change the weight distribution. So it's a much more adjustable option. And the UM522, the 2-bar medium length wheel axle with a 2mm shim on the inside, fits perfectly on this hub carrier. So you don't have to worry too much about spacing. You put, the wheel hex there and it works fine. The only thing is, if you do this option, the medium length axle with the 73mm dog bone, at full droop it doesn't quite connect to the diff out drive. So you would have to limit the droop a little bit to push the dog bone in. Alternately, you can go to a 74mm dog bone. That gives you about 1mm more length there, and that should also work okay. And at least the way this compresses, the inside of the dog bone, or the end of the dog bone, doesn't hit the inside of the diff out drive at full compression, which is good. Otherwise, you'd have some limitation to how the camber changes with suspension articulation. Another option is to use the 73mm dog bone with the long wheel axle here, the UM521 with a 3mm axle shim. Okay, and that will basically push the dog bone in by another millimeter. So essentially, if you count the axle shim length plus the dog bone length, you have a few options. If you go 73 dog bone plus 2mm axle shim, that's the shortest, which gives you an effective dog bone length of 75mm. If you go, the largest would be 74 dog bone plus 3mm shim. That would be a 77mm apparent dog length. So it's about 2mm of play there that you have at your disposal. Is that right? 73, 2, yeah, something like 2 or 3mm. So depending on how much droop you're looking for, you can try those different options. Okay, and because these arms, these works arms, are about the same length as what you have on the 94 YZ10 and the 95 YZ10, these options for the dog bone length, the axle shims, all of that stuff, it should apply to the 94 YZ10 and the 95 YZ10 if you happen to have those as well. So this looks like it does the trick. So that if you want to do hex wheels on a non-870C YZ10, this is how you do it. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.